Hey, folks, welcome to a new episode of the Whiskey Ring podcast. Tonight, we're going back over to Japan. It's been a long time since we've talked to a distillery in Japan or even a project involving Japan. So I'm thrilled to welcome on Roland. He is the general manager Americas for Kanosuke Distillery in Kagoshima, Japan. So, Roland, welcome on.
Thank you. Nice to be here, David.
Absolutely. So, Roland and I have met, we met in person almost a year ago now. It's hard to believe, at a Drammers event.
That long.
To
Wow.
I know it was just before the 24 version, the peated version uh had come out, maybe a month before or something, or a couple of weeks. But we got to try the previous limited editions, went through the core range. We had chatted a bit before and after, and I'm just thrilled to finally have you on for my own sake at this point. So before we get into Konosuke, which so it is pronounced Konosuke
Correct.
as best as I can. You'll see it as Kanosuke or Kanosuke if you're writing it out. So just for people to have it in their minds. Let's start with you before we get into the distillery. You haven't always been on the production retail side of whiskey. You've been involved for years in whiskey, I should say, in the San Francisco scene. So running the San Francisco Whiskey Society, founded Fog City Social, which should be happening in late April this year, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, funny story. I actually wasn't involved in whiskey at all, other than as an enthusiast. Um, but I think all of us. I was working in tech during the pandemic, like many of us. We just realized that working at home and waking up, going to your computer that's either on the same floor as yours or above yours or below yours, it just wasn't that satisfying. And after COVID, I woke up one day and I found myself increasingly just, I wouldn't say not happy, but not motivated. I would wake up and, oh, I should check my social media. Okay, now I need some coffee. You know, I need some fresh grounds because I'm out, and it would just taste that much better with fresh grounds, right? I'd go out and get grounds and make some coffee and come back and say, I'm hungry. Is it a lunchtime yet? And so my point is, I was doing everything I could to avoid work. I loved what I was doing, but I was very tired of the structure and management and whatnot. And I decided that I'm not getting any younger. I should bet on myself, and decided to leave tech and venture in a very scary world of like consulting. And the natural thing to do would be, let's go into tech consulting for the area you were working in, which I was working in telecoms. No, that's too easy. Why don't we do whiskey consulting? And that kind of led me on this path of turning enthusiasm or hobby into what I call my dream retirement job. So that's what I'm doing. I'm living out the job that I always wanted to do, and I'm doing it for a distillery and a product that I really love. So it's kind of perfect. It's not easy. You'll learn that just like anything else, that there's a lot of things that are different when you work versus when you enjoy. But it's been an absolute pleasure for the last year to be with Kanosuke.
I've heard that from many people who are friends of mine who've gone over to the industry and have really made a shift from either completely out of the industry in or kind of on the outside and really moving in. And to a person, almost all of them will say a version of what you said, whereas it's like there's some really difficult things you got to deal with. It's not all sunshine and roses and drinking whiskey all day. uh that's a part of it, and it's a good part of it, and there are some really high highs within that, but it's not just going to work and drinking whiskey all day. There's a lot more to it.
In fact, I probably would say, on whole, I probably drink less than I do before I became part of the team, because you have to understand, when I'm at events or even when I'm out, I'm, regardless if I'm formally there or not, I'm representing the brand. And it's important that you do that in the best way possible, right? So sometimes I would love to have the extra drink, or I would love to have those drinks, but you have to be careful about what you do, what you drink, what you say, because people are watching. And I think it's no different than if you're working for a restaurant or you're working for another industry where people think it might be quote unquote fun, but it's important that you remember your primary goal first before your enjoyment.
Sure. And in especially in the area of the industry that you're working in, your particular role, a lot of it is interfacing with consumers, with retailers who you want to stock your product, distributors, the whole three-tier system really you're interfacing with on two sides of the Atlantic and Pacific. So really all over the world.
Plus media and journalists and influencers and like
Exactly.
yourself. So it's important that we maintain the consistency of what the brand message is, and part of that brand message for me, I'm the sole U.S. representative, right? So it's important that when people see me, they understand what the brand is about, and there's no concerns about my let's say behavior uh, that could happen when you have one or two too many.
For sure. And when you were talking back in November with friend Jack Begwadu, Hood
Yeah.
Sommelier, you said people should like what they like, but I like this quote that you said. It was they have to make sure you're educated about what you're buying. So this is clearly talking to a particular segment of the whiskey drinking industry, or consumer base, I should say. It's consumers who want to know what they're drinking. They want to be educated about it and know what's behind it. And you can't do that if you've had one too many and start going off message and gets a little fuzzy, right?
True. I mean, that wasn't where the genesis of that came from,
Yeah,
but
that
but you're
that was
absolutely
a little
right.
out of context, but yes, yeah,
No, you're absolutely right, to David. But genesis of that was around there, especially in whiskey. There's too many people that are looking for spirits in general. There's too many people that are looking for affirmation from someone else about what they drink or what they taste, and we all have taste buds. What we like is what we like. There's no need for anybody to tell you what you should like, and you don't need to get affirmation from me or you or anyone else about, do I like it in ice cubes? Do I like it with water? Do I like it neat? Do I like it in a cocktail? What you like is what you like. But also, it's important you understand that there's producers making phenomenal things that you may not hear about because they don't have the marketing budget, or they're not as well known, or they're not native to X country or X spirit production category. So it's about learning. And I think, this experience to me has been a lot of learning, and I hopefully a lot of teaching to those that have not thought about whether it's Kanosuke as a Japanese whiskey or any other brand in any other category. It's important that we as consumers are educated about what we're drinking.
for sure. And with that, let's jump right into Kanosuke. So this is a new distillery. It's fair to say. That's you got a license in 2016, and production started in November of 2017. So Kagoshima, this is on the southernmost main island of Japan, of the four islands. It's I've never been there. Japan is my dream trip, and it keeps coming up. Unfortunately, with my wife, I'm like, I want to go. I want to go. But so Kagoshima, according to a May 2024 article in Premium Japan, is first in the country with 13 licensed whiskey manufacturing locations. So note there, not 13 different companies or brands, but 13 locations manufacturing whiskey. What is it about that region that seems to lend itself to this explosion of whiskey manufacturing?
Sure, sure. So let me back up a little bit on some of the things that you shared, because I think that'll lead contextually to the answer. And if I go too detailed, just stop me, and I can slow down. I can talk about this all night. But our family has been making, or has been making spirits and alcohol for over 400 years. So we are from Kyushu Island, which is the most southern island, and in a prefecture called Kagoshima, distilling in a city called Hioki. That will become more important later as we speak. But we started making shochu, which is a distilled national spirit of Japan, 140 years ago. So although our whiskey distillation is new, the family making distilled spirits is not new, doing it over 5 generations at this point. So Kyushu, given its position as the most southern island, it's actually agricultural and distillation capital of Japan. So on Kyushu, you find all the great agricultural products: sweet potatoes, produce, rice, barley. Um, you can even eat chicken sashimi there. You get kiribota pork comes from Kyushu, and right one prefecture over from Kagoshima is Miyazaki Prefecture, which is quite famous for their beef. So, like many southern areas, it is the belly of the country. And I always joke that if you've never been to Kyushu, and if you don't know the geography, or for your listeners that don't know the geography of Japan, Japan has 4 major islands, right? You have Hokkaido up north, you have Honshu in the middle, which is where Tokyo and Osaka and Kyoto is, kind of the Golden Triangle where people visit. You have Okinawa, which people have heard of, but many people haven't heard of Kyushu. And Kyushu is the southern of the island. And I jokingly but lovingly say, if Kyushu were a state, it would be Alabama, except people have their own teeth. I joke because I love people from Alabama, but when you think of Alabama in the South, you think obviously great football and things like that. But if you peel that back, it's really about, there's a lot of Southern pride, and pride in the work they do, pride in the things they make, pride in the things they have, like football and other things. And it's no different in Southern Japan, where people are very proud of the produce we have, the agriculture we have, and the distilling culture we have. In fact, because of all these great agricultural products, as I mentioned, Kyushu is the distillation capital of Japan. So not just the number of new Western spirits distillers and Western spirits licenses, but there's 111 plus or minus Shochu distilleries on Kyushu. So where the Western spirits are coming through is many of the license holders already hold Shochu distillation licenses, because although it is a different spirit, there's a lot of commonality in the distillation techniques, and something that's not been explored, and something that we've just started to do, or we've kind of built our whiskey distillery on. So when we got our license in, like you said, late 2016, 2017, we ended the year, I think, somewhere around 14 distillation licenses in Japan, and that includes all the old distilleries on Honshu and Hokkaido. I think the end of 2024, if I'm not mistaken, that number of licenses, now doesn't mean, like you said, doesn't mean everyone's operating, doesn't mean everyone was making a product or whiskey, but there's something around 200 now licenses in Japan for people making different types of Western spirits. So there's more producers coming, which kind of leads back to the previous point I made about, please make sure you learn and educate and try, because there's a lot of people doing very, very different things now.
Sure. And I do have to pause for a second and go back to something that you said. And I heard on a previous interview, and you said it, and I've seen it on Stephen Lyman's page on Facebook, because he's in the same area, the chicken sashimi. Because I saw him post it once, and I just looked at it and it's like, there's no way. Like, what, how do we do this? So just walk me through for just a brief minute how you can do chicken sashimi.
Again, I think we have to get over our own cultural biases when we look at foods and practices from different countries. And in Japan, it's not common, to be very fair, but it is quite common in southern Kyushu, or Kyushu in general. So Stephen lives up in Fukuoka, which is about a 2-hour north ride from Kagoshima. But yeah, it's texturally appealing. It tastes really good. Yeah, and you have to kind of suspend judgment when you try it, but it's served one of two ways: either like true sashimi, where it's just raw, or you have it in kind of a tataki style, where it's just grilled or seared quickly on either side. and it's delicious. It really is. I love it. I think the chicken liver sashimi is excellent. I know you're cringing at me right now, I'm sure, but you know, don't knock it until you try it. I used to live in Singapore, and I tried durian many times before when I was living in the States and in Canada. And I got it, and I just couldn't stand the smell. I didn't like it. And my friend said, "You have to try it here. It's different." And when I tried it, I absolutely fell in love with it. So I think it's like anything else. It's about perspective. Like if you, the example I give people when they say don't like something, I'd say, if you gave or if you asked a Frenchman or someone here um, the stinkiest Roquefort, right? They would say it absolutely is the most gorgeous and divine thing in the world. Where here you might say, well, or in Asia they would say that smells disgusting because there's not a lot of cheese products like that in Asia. So I think it's a matter of what you're exposed to. And I think my philosophy in life is yeah, be aware, but try it before you judge. And I'll ask you the same thing, David. So when you come to Japan with me and we go and have some tori shash, you're going to try it. I think you're going to love it.
I will try it. I will try it. You're on the hook if something happens and my wife
No
comes after
problem.
you, but
Look, again, there is only a very few places, even in Japan, I would have it. Kyushu being one of them. In fact, there are probably a handful of other restaurants that get fresh chickens that allow you to do that. But yeah, it's not something you rock up to any izakaya for and ask, right? It's just something that you have to be very, very careful.
fair enough. I I know that was completely unrelated to what we're talking about tonight, but I had to ask because I couldn't ask Stephen about it, so I had to ask, and that reminded me. So anyway, going back to the island of Kyushu, the prefecture of Kagoshima. According to that same article, and I'm going off of the article only because I don't have
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
good, I'm not great with geography. Uh, Kanosuke is the closest distillery to the sea in Japan. Now,
Correct.
you
Correct.
already mentioned it's a great agricultural area. It's you get nice high heat, humidity, almost seems a little warmer than temperate, maybe like subtropical in a way. Um, and you also have an active volcano quite nearby. So, with all of that said, what does the microclimate look like for the distillery?
Yeah, I think you did an excellent job of describing it. So, as I mentioned before, our distillery, we are in Kagoshima Prefecture. The closest major city is Kagoshima City, but we're about 35 minutes or so due west of the city, and our distillery sits in a city called Hioki. Hioki, it's ironic. So everyone knows that the um, Japan is kind of known as the land of the rising sun, and the sun usually rises in the east, right? Well, Hioki in English translates to the place where the sun sets. So we're in the land of the rising sun, but the distillery is placed right at the tip where the sun sets. In fact, the distillery itself sits on a cliff that overlooks the third longest sandy beach in Japan, which just happens to be a sanctuary for and natural egg-laying habitat for the Japanese loggerhead turtle. So it's kind of a crazy, clean, perfect beach. But as you said, across the island, you have a still active volcano called Sakurajima, which erupts a couple times a week. In fact, when I was there last May on a press trip, we all left about noon. The volcano erupted around 3 o'clock. So it's quite funny. The first time I visited, was driving around and you see children get out of buses, right? And it's normal, the normal view of Japanese children. They have full uniforms. They have the full large leather backpack that's synonymous with Japanese school kids. But instead of wearing a hat, many of them were wearing hard hats. And if you didn't know any better, you would think there's like a Bob the Builder convention going on in Southern Japan, but it's not. They're wearing the hats to be protective of if the volcano erupts. So they live with it like we in California live with earthquakes. It's not a big deal. And in fact, it's created some crazy microclimates and agriculture products where, like on the volcano itself and just around it, grows the smallest mandarin orange in the world. It's somewhere between the size of a kumquat and those cuties you get at Costco or Trader Joe's, those cuties that people love to eat like candy. They're in between that size. In fact, the cuties look like grapefruit compared to these things, and they're wonderful. And they only grow around this island, which we happen to use to make our gin, right? So it's just really funny that you have this, but as a result, in the summer we have, you're right, it's subtropical. It's could be, let me translate to Fahrenheit, somewhere around over 100 degrees and 95% humidity. In the winter, it will snow, right? And we have these winds that come off the ocean and rip right through the warehouse, which is on that same cliff. So there's a lot of natural winds that come that give a lot of exchange of liquid. So as you know, right, your expansion during the liquid exchange during the winter is much more important than during summer. That's when you have the contraction versus the expansion, and it makes our distillate go through the wood. It gets the environmental impact, and these kind of crazy microclimates force that faster maturation to give us what we think is our kind of classic taste of Kanosuke, which we call mellow whiskey.
And I do have to say the mellow portion of it for me it certainly holds true. I mean the three products that I tasted that well I tasted more than three, but the three products that are available that I tasted that night were the core Kanosuke single malt Japanese whiskey,
Yep.
the Hioki pot still Japanese whiskey, and the double distillery Japanese whiskey. So we're talking respectively 48% ABV, 51%, and 53%. Then we get a little bit more into them later on, but the just to hit on the mellow point right now, I have always said, malt whiskeys or well, I'll say malt whiskeys. I know the Hioki pot still is not totally malt. We'll talk about that too. And the double distillery is 50-50, but basically not corn distillate can have a great mouthfeel and texture and a lot more heft at a lower ABV than corn can. So at 48%, 51, and 53, all three of these in my tasting notes, I noted how there was a pleasant spice to it, a little bit of black pepper and some, well, I wouldn't even say woodiness. There was no woodiness in any of my notes. It was more just about enough spice to give body, but otherwise very easy drinking. And especially when you get to that 53%, you're going over the 100 proof mark. That's no small thing to say that it's still mellow. And I think it's a better word to use than smooth, because smooth, we know, could go in any different direction. So with that, I want to dive in a little bit to this. This might be a little hypothetical. So tell me if we're going too hypothetical on this, but as I said, the family's been distilling shochu in the area for 140 years. If I read right, it also brew in sake for up to 400 years.
Yeah, so that's where the family started to make alcoholic products. They didn't do that
Right,
for commercial purposes. In fact, they were making sake for a temple in Kagoshima that honored
right,
that honored the crane.
right,
So they were doing that for several hundred years before the thought of commercial alcohol production came into mind.
right. So as I said, this might be the evolution of the family, but it's by no means the out of nowhere expansion.
Correct.
I'm curious about this 2016 date. So Kamasa-san, the current generation master distiller owner, Yoshitsugu.
It's
Hope I please correct my pronunciations if I am totally off on something. But Yoshitsugu,
you're doing just fine.
he enrolled at the Tokyo University of Agriculture originally to study liquor production and fermentation.
Yeah.
This was pre 2016. This was a couple years before. So he would have had family experience, assumedly, just growing up around it, particularly commercially. But then he also went to go study it more formally. I'm curious if you've ever spoken to him about how these two paths mesh in practice,
Sure,
the
sure, sure.
hands-on and the less practical.
Sure, sure. So we will get more into it later as we kind of talk through the expressions. But both Kamasa-san, who's my boss and the CEO of Kanosuke Distillery, and his younger brother Norisa, were both very inspired by their grandfather to come back to work in the spirits business. So you kind of talk about the family history, you have to go back to the 1950s when Kamasa-san's grandfather, the second generation founder of the family business, came back from World War II, and he was kind of like, how do I rebuild my family business? How do I help rebuild the country after all this devastation? And what he realized was that Shochu, it's a wonderful product. It's a wonderful product, but it's similar, and I'm using a lot of conjecture, but let's say it's very similar to like sherry and vermouth or poitrin in Ireland, where you know people know the product, they love the product, but not many people, especially the younger generation, are drinking it.
Mm.
So Kamasa-san at that time um, just did some market research on what was selling well. And if you looked around what was selling well back then, it was uh, brown spirits, brandy, cognac, whiskey, rum, aged aged tequila. So I said, great. I have this wonderful idea. Why don't I age shochu and sell it? Well, the problem is that shochu it's a national product, and for all its great things, it's protected by the Japanese government against foreign products coming in, right? So when there was foreign expansion earlier in the century, or kind of during the Restoration period, when whiskey and rum were coming into Japan, it was a challenger to soju. So one of the things that the Japanese government had enacted was basically laws against what authentic shochu was, and part of that was in order to qualify, without boring you, to be shochu, you had to meet both a color and clarity requirement. So not that you can't age it, but shochu's aged. It's aged in ceramic urns. So no matter kind of how long you age it, you're going to get to pretty much a dark or kind of off-white or amber yellow color, right? You're not going to get much darker than that, and it has to be clear. So that when the rum manufacturers and the whiskey manufacturers were coming in, they could place taxes and tariffs on them that are higher than shochu, because they would argue that, well, shochu is a distilled product just like whiskey and rum. It's like, ah, yes, but you're not, you're not this amber color,
Mm-hmm.
and you're not clear, right? So great, it worked. But now when Kamasa-san wanted to make aged shochu, he couldn't, because he didn't meet the color and clarity requirement. And this is important because it comes back later to modern day. So being the enterprising gentleman he was, and part of the Kamasa family, which you're seeing over generations, has just come up with more and more innovation. Said, okay, how do I make aged shochu without putting any color or violating clarity on it? And the TLDR, as the kids say, is that he figured out how to long age without doing that, by essentially moving liquid quickly from cask to cask to get flavor, but not color. And obviously, when he released it, it was, oh, this is terrible. No one likes this. This is not a real product. It's not shochu, etc. But it tasted really good. And ultimately, people that visited Kyushu said, oh, this is the thing that we need to bring back. This is the thing that people need to have. And it became this beloved spirit of Kyushu. So we started that in 1957. So we actually have 75 years of barrel age experience. So fast forward to 2 generations later, when Kamasa-san joined the company as a student after university, he was selling shochu and wanted to continue to sell shochu because the big boom in the 1980s, he was coming in the early 2000s saying, I'm going to sell shochu. What he quickly realized, it was a lot harder than he initially anticipated, and frankly had. And you can read it. He's written or said several things in interviews where he's gotten big sales in Europe and in America. Came back to wait for the order, and the orders never came. And he quickly realized, like, shochu, as much as he loves it, and his grandfather and his father passed on the love of this to him, it just was not a spirit that was booming. So he loved other spirits. So he decided to, after visiting Scotland and Kentucky, and he loved these whiskey spirits. He said, I want to do something else to kind of tell the next chapter in the story of the Kamasa family and kind of the next chapter in what shochu making was. So he decided to open Kanosuke Distillery to tell the story of shochu through the lens of whiskey. So what we do that's a lot different than others is that I would say that we are honoring the techniques of Scottish and Irish traditional whiskey making, but we challenge all the convention of the things that people say you have to do, but there's no rules or laws against it. And that's how we make our whiskey, where we integrate Japanese distillation techniques learned from generations of shochu making into making Western style whiskey. And we comply with all of the quote unquote rules and regulations of Scottish whiskey making. And Kamasa-san was actually part of the JSMLA, Japanese Spirits and Liquors Manufacturers Association, that define the self-governing standards of what Japanese whiskey is. So, that's why it's really, really important to us that we follow the rules, we follow guidelines, and we're not making shochu or we're not bottling whiskey from other countries and calling it Japanese whiskey, because we want to make an authentic product. And not to say that those products are not good, but as JSML would define them, and as Kamasa would say, they're not authentic Japanese whiskey.
Sure. And as of April 2021, can no longer be called Japanese whiskey. You can, and
Correct.
we went more into that in early episodes with, for example, with Stephen Lyman, with Chris Pellegrino, with Stephen Van Eycken as well, and talking about these changes in the laws and how it affected both the larger, the heritage, if you will, the Suntory, the Nikas, versus the smaller, newer, even older but smaller distilleries around the country. Speaking of Stephen Van Eycken, actually, there was a great interview that Kamasa-san did with him in, I believe, 2023, and he said, as you just mentioned, that he'd gone to the U.S., to Scotland, to see what was there, to train, to distill, to learn kind of on the job about whiskey distillation in particular, as opposed to shochu distillation. The first thing I thought of is it's kind of hard not to see some echoes of Masataka Taketsuru going over to Scotland and coming back and with his techniques, which is just fascinating to me. But more importantly, I wanted to ask, like, were there particular places that he said, he trained? I don't know how much. This is where I need clarification. I don't know how much was visiting versus training versus. So, like, were there places he trained that really like spoke to him more than others? Let's say, in terms of how to do it.
I think you probably need to ask Kamasa-san directly, but as I've learned from him, it wasn't like Taketsuru where he spent 6 months at I think it was Longmorn. I think it was more of a, I'm going to spend 6 weeks and explore, and I might spend a few days here and there. So I think it was more an appreciation for the culture and learning from techniques that he picked up at different distilleries rather than one distillery being this is the influence for what I do. I could be completely wrong, but I've never heard of him. Now, to be fair, I've never asked him directly if there's one distillery that kind of gave him the motivation. But I think just from what I've seen and what I've heard and what he's told me, it was just a series of like, I like this from here, I like this from here, and the same thing in Kentucky. It may all just be the respectfulness of the Japanese, where it wasn't an internship, it wasn't an apprenticeship anywhere. It was more of a friendly visits and a learning. But again, I can't be sure.
Fair enough. Again, it was
Hey,
something
just to add one thing you mentioned earlier about yes, I'm like they're actually not laws. I they are self-regulating guidelines because the JSMLA is an industry body. It'd be kind of like the American Single Malt Association or something, where they're recommending, but they're not writing policy for the government to regulate it and create a law. So I think ultimately we would like that. But it is as I said, it's a self-regulating guideline. So there's no producer that, again, you have to want to do it. But I think it's a little different in Japan, where that kind of pride of work says you're going to follow because you committed to follow, versus here, where I think, again, not stating all companies do this, but I think you and I both have jaywalked before, not because we knew it wasn't against the law, but we knew that we could. So maybe a little different philosophy in Japan.
yeah. I mean, and you've been to, I haven't been to San Francisco, but you've been to New York. Like if you don't jaywalk, and even if it's against the light and there's no cars coming, if you don't go, like people are going to push you, especially Midtown. You got to go. So no, I hear that. So with that, going into the next topic, so this is really getting to the nuts and bolts of the operation, and starting with the grains and the yeast that we're doing. So Japan, even though Kyushu and Kagoshima are very fertile, agriculturally bountiful areas, the majority of Japan and this is generalization, but it's very mountainous. It's there's not a lot of areas like that across the entire archipelago, chain of islands, because I can't say that word right now. Thank you. Where you can grow things like barley, and barley may not be the primary thing that you need to grow in the areas that you can grow. So the most of the barley that you're using is coming from UK, continental Europe, correct, Australia, normal
correct,
sources for barley around the world. Though you do have about 10% coming from the domestic agricultural market. It just from what I know and from random guessing, I mean, it sounds like getting to the 100% of the necessary supply domestically is not realistic. But do you have a kind of a target in mind for what you'd like, or is the 10% like a good enough range to say that there's a local component in there?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, because first of all, great question. And one of the things that you'll find with me and our company is that we're 100% transparent about what we do. We believe that because it doesn't matter what I tell you, unless you have a distillery right next to mine, and I can actually give you the blueprints to distillery. You couldn't make what we make. And it's interesting that a lot of manufacturers, especially in the East, and I think it's probably back to their topic about authenticity and product, like to go back to it's a secret. It's a family secret. It's a trade secret. Now, there's certain things that we won't look you into in our distillery because it's not safe, but it's not certainly because it's not a secret. We have nothing to hide. And I think as people learn about new whiskeys and new products, ask. Because if the answer is, I can't tell you, it's a secret, there might be something that they're hiding. I'm not insinuating anything, but for us, it's about being perfectly honest. And the reason I start with that anecdote is because before I stepped into this or turned to this side of the table, it was like you always asking about local barley and is there a target? Do you want to do that? Everything should be local. And I asked this question to Ichiro Akudo, who's the owner of Venture Whiskey, which famously makes Chichibu. And I also asked to Yumi, his brand master. And as you know, they're doing a lot of local barley production. They're trying to do local malting and stuff. And I asked the same question. I said, are you trying to do more? Are we trying to be 100% local? And their answer was really interesting. He said, we want to use what tastes good. So in Japan, as you said, there's not a lot of natural local barley production for a variety of reasons. In fact, most of the beer they make is use rice versus barley, and it's for taste. And you said, look, we could use more, but will it give us the same quality product that we want? So the answer to your question is, I don't know. But I think Kamasa is driven by the same spirit of the choices he makes about product has been about quality and about flavor. So if he can do that with local barley and it makes sense, he'll absolutely do it. But if it doesn't make sense and it costs more, it's difficult, and you deliver a substandard product, he won't. So I don't know if that's directly answer your question, but
Yeah.
as much as we would like to, I think the answer is not so simple about getting to a target. The answer is about let's make sure we start with the objective, which is a quality product.
No, I think that that perfectly answers it. It's to pull in an author that I've been pulling in a lot lately, Dave Broom. He's got two books here that would work. The Whiskeys of Japan, which obviously went into the Whiskeys of Japan, very self-explanatory, but also Sense of Place, which came out right after.
Yeah.
And I think both are applicable here. There's the sense of you want to do something local that's representing the place where you're at, but the place where you're at doesn't necessarily have that. So, we'll talk about this with the products as well, but the inclusion of things like the Shochu casks and being where you are in a subtropical environment as opposed to the the Hakushus, Yamazakis, etc., that are farther north, that are going to have a completely different microclimate. It doesn't have to be about the barley. It can be in certain places, but if that's not feasible based on practicalities,
Right.
then you find other ways to differentiate yourself, and that's perfectly fine. For me, as long as there's something about the brand that does differentiate, that shows that sense of place, so that they're, you care about where you are and you're trying to incorporate that. It doesn't have to be barley. It can be any part of the process, which, again, there's more to get into there. But so, as I with the barley coming from multiple locations, that's normal. That's even for Scotch, as much as they would not like to say it, especially as we're seeing
Sure.
their reaction to the English Whiskey Guild's suggested rules. We're seeing
Funny.
they're not so happy about that. Oh my God.
So it's really entertaining to read it. I have to say, I don't mean
It
to laugh,
is.
but it's really entertaining.
It is. It's hilarious. So we could do a whole episode just on that. I'd love to. It's so ridiculous. But anyway, to focus it on Kanosuke just for now, the barley coming in, if I have the estimate right, is about 85% unpeated, 15% peated, somewhere
Looks
around
like
there,
that.
give or take. I did have one clarifying question, which was, when you're talking about the peated side of it, is the peated whiskey, or sorry, the peated malt, I should say, coming all from one source?
Well, I would say coming from one primary source,
Okay.
but we have backup sources for everything, but they're all repeated malts coming from the UK.
Okay.
Yeah.
Baird's, the or
I believe we use
or
Muntins.
okay, that was my second guess. So,
Yeah.
um, I do have to ask. So so you again, we're going to a sense of place here, and the background in sake and shochu production. You don't cook the mash traditional way, so you're steaming the barley.
We do that on the Hioki product.
On the Yoki.
So as we kind of go through the products, if you think about the single malt, that's done in a classic, quote unquote, classic style of how single malt whiskey is made. The two differences are one, we distill on 3 pot stills versus 2, right? And the reason why we do that, so we have a large wash still, it's about 6,000 liters. Then we have our first spirit still is about 3,000-ish liters, and it produces a heavy type distillate. So for your listeners that don't know what that is, um, it's a larger bottomed popcorn still, but has a descending line arm, right? So that you allow much more of the distillate to pass through. The third still is what we call a light type. So upward line arm angle, kind of restricted at the bottom. So there's more challenge for the distillate to rise and more of the flavor and sometimes impurities fall. So we use that because I'm sure people know that most distilleries in Scotland, Japan, um, maybe 15, 20, maybe 25% of what they make is released under their own name. Everything else is sold to larger blending houses or sold to IBs. So when they do that, there are flavor profiles that these producers expect to get, right? Like your Johnny Walker, right? They're looking for certain profiles from certain producers that go into their other product. Masa-san's philosophy is that, look, we're young, we're new. I don't know what tastes good yet. So I want to have the variety of distillate that we make. And we've, run through the wash still, then spirit still one. We've run through the wash still, then spirit still two. During COVID, when there wasn't much production, we used spirit still one as the wash still. And now we're experimenting with triple distillation where we run through one, two, then three, right? So there's a lot of things we're doing just to see what our distillate's going to taste like, and then obviously what our agent's going to look like in a couple of years, so we can figure it out. I mean, we're just at the end of 24, we turned 7 years old, right? With first drops of liquid coming off still November 17, November 24 was our 7th year of production. So we're very young. We don't know what tastes good. We don't know what the optimal age is. We don't know what the optimal barrel combinations are. So we want to do that, right? The second thing that I think we do very differently, and this is harking back to um, our family history, is because we made barrel aged shochu. As we mentioned before, we have 7 years of barrel aging experience. So after we disgorged the shochu from barrels, we sent them off to a cooperage just about 2 hours away, called Ariake. And we instruct them to do two things. We ask them to reshave and rechar the barrels. We don't retoast. The reason why we don't do that is because we want to retain the residual shochu flavor in the barrel. So after we rechar it, we bring it back, and that's where we put our distillate into our single malt distillate. So we're about, in our kind of single malt production, we do about 30-ish% in shochu casks, another 30 to 35% in bourbon barrels, and then the rest is everything else. Sherry, sherry, excuse me, different kinds of sherry casks, different types of wine casks, rum casks, beer casks, etc.
I should say when I saw the Dramers event, I got to taste some of that, just the shochu ex shochu component. And I mean, it was strong. It was at 62%. So it was
Sure.
definitely not the first pour of the night, but it
Right.
was it was fascinating. It had, I just want to go down to my notes here because I brought them out just for this. It was uh, it wasn't finished, so it was just in the cask. I got a lot of savory baking spice to it,
Mm.
orange creamsicle, tropical flavors. It felt like it drank closer to around like a 55% 110 proof as opposed to
Yeah.
124 proof, which I know for some people is like, what's the difference at that point? But for, after a few and your palates, like it's a big difference. It drank much less hot than it should have, frankly, for 62%. So that's a great thing. And there is a distillery only component series that is available at distillery only. So you got to go visit there to try it. But that is a nerd like me's dream, is to try things like that. So that was fantastic.
Yeah. I mean, the first time I tasted it, I tasted the single malt before I tasted the shochu cask, and I didn't even know they're putting it in at the time because again, when I tasted the first time, I was just tasting it as a consumer. And you get this like exactly the kind of notes you're describing, like this baking spice. I call it kind of a light cinnamon. Um, but you get this like umami, which you're talking about in kind of the savory notes, and the viscosity of it is just it's a very different mouthfeel, and all that I think is attributed to the shochu cask, which we pioneered that, so we're kind of like cradle to grave on it in terms of where we used it, where it started, and kind of where it finishes. And I'm sure we're not going to be the only producer that's going to do it because, like I said, you're sitting in an island with many shochu producers. But I'm glad that Kamasa-san really tried to integrate a lot of these techniques and learnings from shochu into whiskey, and he really is doing what he said, try to tell the story of shochu through this lens of whiskey, and thinking about it as the next generation of whiskey making, right? And it's kind of like our corporate slogan, right? Is that we're making the next generation of Japanese whiskey from Kagoshima's Mellow Coast. We really are being true to that in terms of how we do it and why we do it. It's quite neat actually to see the results of it.
For sure. And so just jumping back to the grain for a second, thank you for clarifying that the steaming the grain rather than the traditional mash cook that's done at Hioki. I do have to ask. So this at Hioki, that's mostly shochu production. You use the shochu stills to distill what's about 90%. So it's 100% barley still, but it's 90% unmalted two row and about 10% dehulled malt. And weird quirk of that, which I heard, was that because
Backwards. So
it's back.
so
Okay,
so 10% malted barley, 90% dehulled local barley. It's the same local barley
okay, I had
we're
the
using
yeah.
for shochu making.
Okay, so yeah, I put the dehulled
Yep.
adjective in
Yep.
the wrong place.
Yep.
So because it's not 100% malted, it's technically a grain whiskey, which like it makes sense on the regulation side, and on paper it just hadn't thought about it. I would still think, oh, it's barley, so it's, but anyway. So just for that portion of it where you're doing this more shochu style grain treatments, I have to ask, was there any temptation to use koji fermentation for that portion?
No.
None, not at all. Hard no.
So it's really funny because the inspiration for this whiskey was from Kamasa's journey to Kentucky, where he spent a lot of time tasting bourbon, and he really liked it. And he kind of came back to Kagoshima or Japan and said, "All right, team, I have a little bit of an Apollo 13 challenge for you. Um, I really like bourbon. Um, I'd like you to try to make those flavor profiles, but two things. You can't use any corn, and two, I'm not building you a column still. Good luck." So it was through experiment that we kind of took this concept and used shochu technique and shochu equipment to see if we could replicate these flavors. And that's kind of how this whiskey is born. And I think as you taste it, or as you nose it, certainly, but then as you taste it, you get a lot of elements of like uh, butterscotch, vanilla, baking spice, caramel. It really is like if bourbon and Irish whiskey had a baby in Japan, this is what it would kind of taste and look like.
With there is one other, well, a couple of significant differences, I should say, but the um, one of them, which is kind of American style, if you will, at Hioki, you're distilling on grain, so throwing the
Correct.
whole mash into the pot. Whereas
Right.
um, at Kanosuke, you're doing clear wort
Right.
into the pot. Um, at With the shochu stills, it's also, I found fascinating, these vacuum stills. So two main questions about this. One is just to explain, how a vacuum still works. The second part is these are all stainless steel. So as far as I know, no copper involved.
Yeah.
So why don't we start with what is a vacuum still? Like, how does that work? And
Yeah.
because I don't think we've touched on this on the podcast before.
Yeah. So basically, what you're doing is you're doing distillation under vacuum pressure, so you can do it over a longer period of time, but at a lower temperature. So the temperature difference in distillation is probably somewhere between 25 and 30 C. So we're doing a slow and low extraction of the, you know, of the mash, if you will, right, or the wort. Um, the reason why we do it is because we have the equipment and we wanted to use the same equipment that we used for shochu making. Um, and the best kind of consumerish analogy I would provide, because I've thought about multiple ways to explain this, is think about today where you can grill a piece of steak, right? It's beautiful. It may cook a little unevenly. You get some spots of char, and that's probably not what you want, but it's a really beautiful piece of meat. You can also sous vide a piece of steak. And what sous vide is, right? You're essentially putting under pressure in a vacuum, taking all the air, and you're slow and low cooking it for a longer period of time, which doesn't create the look of a grilled steak, but there's no char spots. It's cooked evenly. It's perfect. So think of us as sous videing the wort, if you will. And when I said that at one masterclass, someone jumped up and said, "It's like Southern." I said, "Really? What do you mean Southern?" Like slow barbecue. I'm like, "Yeah, okay, yeah, that's pretty good." But the question around, so these pots, right? They're large, several thousand liter stainless steel pots. So the first question is, oh, that's not whiskey. It's not made out of copper. Um, there's no regulation that says you have to use a copper pot still. It's a convention that people use copper. And the reason why they use copper is because during high heat distillation, you create a lot of impurities. A lot of those impurities are in the form of sulfites. And what the copper does is it attaches to the sulfites and you can filter out as copper sulfate. Well, if you don't create the impurity in the first place, you don't need the copper. So by doing kind of slow and low, we don't get those char spots, if you will. We don't get a lot of those impurities. So we can distill um, under vacuum pressure without copper and deliver a wonderful distillate, which would then have to filter, right? And then becomes a beautiful thing. But Hioki Pot Still is actually our most technical whiskey because we're merging together all of these techniques from traditional whiskey making to shochu making, starting with how we do the mash. Because you're right, we don't do a traditional mash cook. It's a steam method. So everything just goes straight into a fermentation tank after that. So it's quite funny when you peel it back. You think, oh, it's interesting spirit, but it's extremely technical what we do. So after we distill it, we age half of it in ex bourbon, barrels and half of it in new American white oak puncheons. And after we age them separately, we bring them together to create the final product of Kyoki pasta.
And just for uh, size keeping purposes, so traditional barrels about 53 gallons, so 200 liters. Puncheons
Liters.
about 250 liters. Yeah, it's about 25% larger. Well, actually, more than that if I'm doing the math. So considerably larger, but less wood contact um, in there. So, but it's new oak, so it's also there's a balance to be had there between the new oak but less exposure.
Right, which is the nod back to bourbon making.
Mhm.
So we're
Right.
using new American white oak pensions, right? So we're doing that along with the bourbon barrel. So that imparts, obviously lots of the flavor. But yeah, it is 100% barley product. It's a single pot, single grain product. Um, that's not using low end grains. We're using very high end grains to make what we think is a quite unique product. And I think over time, I do a lot of tastings, right? And
Mhm.
no matter what you tell people about your tasting, even though they know they're walking into a Japanese whiskey tasting, I always ask, well, what flavors do you like, right?
Mhm.
Inevitably, there's 20, 30%. It's like, I like bourbon. And before I would have nothing to share with them, but now I have something it's not bourbon, but it's bourbon adjacent in that, you can get some of those flavors that people are familiar with in those vanillas and butterscotch and caramel and baking spice, but it's really not bourbon. Actually, it's not bourbon at all. It's not
Sure.
even a bourbon mash.
Right. Uh, so just shifting over to the other distillery, to Kanosuke Distillery, where you're making the single malt. You went through the three stills there before. Um, I have to ask. So the through the photos that I've seen both on the website and other people taking photos, I feel like I'm getting a little bit of photo, not deception, not the right word, but like it's distorting the view a little bit. But the stills don't look like, they look fairly short. Even the 6,000 liter wash still looks fairly, maybe slightly taller than a average height man, like 6 7 feet or something. Um, I know you said that they're not huge stills to begin with, and but to get a sense just for me, like how tall would you say the still is if you were to stand next to it?
So a little bit of smoke and mirrors. Our distillery is built on 2 floors. So half the still is on the bottom of the first is on the first floor, and the pictures you're seeing are from the second floor.
Okay, so we're just seeing the necks as opposed to the
So
pots.
you're just seeing the neck up, right?
Gotcha.
Or part of the neck up, right?
Right.
There's maybe a little more, right, on the bottom, but there's a lot down low. The reason why we do that is because our whole distillery is elevated on 2 floors because the fermentation tanks, which you may or not seen a picture of, are at floor level on the second floor. We do that
Mhm.
because that's how shochu fermentation tanks are. Where, in kind of Western style whiskey, everyone kind of like climbs up to get to the fermentation tank, and then they're dumping things on top. It's tall, and some are open top, some are not. In shochu, you build the floor or a second floor at the opening of the fermentation tank because it's easier and safer. You're going to be working up there all the time. You're taking samples from there. You're dropping whatever you might need in there. You're cleaning from there. So we've actually built a second floor where the top of the shochu fermentation tank is at ground level. And that's why our distillers built like that. And that's why you see a little bit of distortion in the pictures of the still because they're built on the first floor, but they pop up to the second floor.
Gotcha. Okay, makes much more sense. Um, so the stills, which are Miyake stills,
It's
not they're a Japanese still maker, obviously, relatively new to whiskey stills, I believe. Although I did notice that uh, Kamagatake is also using them, so you're by no means the only distillery using them. What are these stills offer that or maybe that's not the right way to ask this question, but why go with the Miyake stills versus the more traditional, like I don't know, a Forsyth, the Vendome, with the
Or say out there,
more,
Vendome or something.
yeah, yeah,
Again, I don't know. I mean, they were obviously installed before I joined, and I can certainly follow up and ask. But I think, um, as much as we can forge our own path around using products. Obviously not discounting anything for quality, but if we can achieve the same quality and kind of go through the path that we've gone by using local products, I think that we will. I think it's just easier, probably much more cost effective for us as well, and we could probably get them faster than getting in line at Forsyth or Vendome or any other manufacturers. Plus, I think when you have the producer or the manufacturer locally, if you need help or you need support or whatnot, it's also much easier, and there's no language barrier, right? So I don't know. I'm speculating at this point. I could certainly ask, but I'm sure all of that contributed to the rationale.
I'm sure. And just looking back from other conversations with other distilleries that were starting around the same time or a little, yeah, just around the same time. I mean, mid 20 teens, we're looking at minimum 3 year wait times at most of these places. That's
Yeah.
when distilleries or distill. Let's try this again. Still makers. There we go. Like like Carl in Germany became, and Frilly in Italy became more available because Vendome and Forsyth, you had to wait years. So if you got years up to wait for the still and then years to wait for the product, most do not have the capital to keep it going for that long and wait for a product. So no, that makes perfect sense. And for without knowing 100% sure, all of the points you listed are perfect rationales for why you would do that. So it makes total sense. So as of 20 as of last year, you had about 5,000 barrels in storage. And as you said, it's a mix of ex bourbon, ex shochu, sherry, wine barrels, rum barrels. You said as well. So a healthy mix to see what tastes good, what works, and give yourself a lot of paints to paint with. In the pictures that I've seen, the barrels look like they are racked in a fairly traditional manner. Um, Maybe in different positions sometimes, but fairly. But it does look like you're running out of room. So as of December of last year, you had 8 warehouses in 5 locations. What is the growth plan looking like?
So I don't know if we let me count to one, two, three, four, five, six. I think in that eight is included a large warehouse we just finished. So it's right next to the distillery. Not many pictures of it have been sent out, but we built a pretty large uh, warehouse in a plot of land just I guess it'd be just south of the distillery. So in the next plot over. So we have plenty of room now because we've been using everything we can for storage. And in fact, one I guess it's a sad but funny story, but also very enlightening is that as you know, the population of Japan has been gradually declining, and especially if you go to these villages and cities that are outside major metro areas like Hyoki, the result of that is that a lot of schools have been closing. So, in order to kind of revitalize the environment or the city, Kamasasan actually bought an old elementary school, and the intention of it was to use the school as our head office. Eventually we would turn it into our corporate office. Um, but at the same time, we purchased it. We have rented some of it to a co-working space, but the other part of it, we weren't ready to do that construction work yet. We've been using the school gymnasium as a warehouse, and so you can see racks of where barrels right next to the old scoreboard, and we actually store some materials in the offices and classrooms. So like I said, it's sad that it's happening, but we're trying to revitalize. We're doing what we can, we were just running out of space. So literally putting barrels in closets, right? So we finally have built a secondary large warehouse that's next to the distillery that can store much more of our product, especially once we started making Hioki. We had two distilleries making product. We just ran out of room. But they're all within, a couple square miles of each other. We've not seen a noticeable difference between the aging in all of them because they all kind of get that kind of ocean air because we're all very, very close. And yeah, hopefully the second one keeps us going for a couple years before we have to build a new one.
True, true. And so with that, the three core range that are going to be available, in the US,
Yeah.
not in every market, but we'll include links in the show notes for where to find it. If you can find it, as Roland said at the beginning, he's the only guy here in America right now, so you can only stretch so far. But there are three core products. You got the Kanosuke single malt Japanese whiskey, the Hioki pot still, and again the double distillery, which is the 50/50 blend of the other two. Um, it's not the 50/50 blend of distillates; it's the 50/50 blend of product, right? Like they're aged separately and then blended.
Correct.
Right. Uh, so you have those three, and in addition to that, there are the limited editions that are coming out starting in 2021, coming out in like March, April each year or so. So, I got to try, I believe 21 and 23 that night, and I mean they were both just fascinating expressions. I'll have my notes on them for sure, but I really encourage people to try the core range. And I wanted to pull this out because right now the core range is looking at about 3 to 4 year average. Um, Maybe it's touched there and a little bit older, but I mean you just hit 7 years. It's not so much more older you can go at that point.
Correct.
Uh, but you've also got the subtropical climate, so you're aging. However they would measure this at about the 3-to-1 ratio to
Correct.
Scotland. Let's say you're getting a 6 to 8 to even 10% angel share per year. So you're losing a lot more interaction, faster aging, naturally faster aging, I should say. So, I found that in tasting these, this tasted far more mature on one side, so not young at all, but they also didn't feel forced. We've all had those whiskeys that are on the younger side, but they do something to them, oak chips or smaller barrels or what have you. And it's not to say no one's been successful doing that, but it's exception rather than the rule that they've been successful with doing things like that.
Correct.
So this is a really nice spirit that it tastes and feels like right where it should be. And at 3 to 4 years, that's also that's lucky and practical in a way because it means you don't have to age it for 12 to put it out and have a great product. I'm curious because I have to ask this question.
Of course.
Is What is the oldest distillate that you've got going?
Yeah. Well, the oldest distillery we have going is 7 years and 4 months. Yeah, 7 years and 4 months, right? Since first drops are on November 16th, I think, 2017. So now November, December, January, February, March. So yeah, almost 4 months. So I would say 7 years and 4 months. We have some of our first barrels still aging. But that's the natural question you're going to ask is, will we see age statements coming? Very interesting question. I've asked Kamasa-san about this, and he's again very practical and very frank. He's like, I don't know. And I said, well, I mean, everyone wants to know, you're going to have a 10-year, an 8-year, 15-year. And he's like, I would aspire to, I think, but I don't know because I don't know if it's going to taste good
Sure, I mean
at that age because of
yeah,
our hyper aging environment. So it's not that he's opposed to it, but we have to have enough whiskey and it has to taste good. And I think we will determine if it makes sense to do that. I mean, as you can see from what he's doing already, he's not trying to make a bunch of money or trying to do things that are crazy. He could do a lot of things that would give us more revenue, that would be more popular to consumers, right? If you look at just how we bottle, 48, 51, and 53%, our CFO is probably going crazy saying, why are you putting that much alcohol in these products when you don't have to? And again, his response is, I'm the master blender. This is where it tastes good to me. And I think he's right. Um, so it's really funny. I had this discussion last night. I was at an event. We're talking about core expressions, and people were surprised at how high these cores were, right? Because normally, well, your cores around, let's say 40 to 43, maybe 45, and 46 at the top. We start at 48 and go up to 53. Mm. And it's amazing that when you taste some of these expressions, I'm not picking on anyone. Some of the ones you taste, they use that they really fit in that definition you said of forced, right? That it's amazing to me how a 40% whiskey can taste both watery and hot at the same time. Because there's just no balance there, right? They forced it to 40 because that's the highest or lowest I could be before I could qualify for to be a single malt, but it gave me my maximum revenue opportunity. And that's just not how Kamasu-san operates. He wants to operate to where he's making truly the next generation of where whiskey needs to be and where it tastes good. So I love the fact that our whiskey can be approachable for new whiskey drinkers that don't need the heat. 40% could be really hot for them because they're used to drinking wine or something else or beer. But for experienced palates like yourself and mine, that I still find something every time I taste it. And I don't taste that watery thing that I get in auto whiskey. So I appreciate what he's done around there, and I hope that we can have age statements at some point. But I don't need them if the whiskey continues to progress like this.
I'll be honest. I wasn't even going to ask about the age question, the age statement. Um, but in a way, I guess I was. So the way that I was going to ask it was, if you've got some of those original barrels still
We
going,
do,
which yes, you do.
yeah.
Um, but also, like, is there a willingness, which it sounds like there is, to just let it go? See, allow it to continue aging, see how long it can go, till it hits a point where you're like, oh, I don't know if this is like this is there's a turning point where it becomes too aged and takes on too much wood character. And that could be that could be next month, it could be in 5 years. You never know exactly. But um no, it's good. I like that too, because there's a willingness to push it for sure. But again, you've got great whiskey at a 3 to 4 year uh average. To me, that doesn't need the age statements. I know, especially with Japanese whiskey, people went crazy over the age statements, more so when they went away in
Yeah.
the 2000s and early 2010s. But it
But
you don't
also
need it.
people took advantage of that. And, back to the point about education, they really confused the market, right?
Mhm.
During COVID, right? As we all know, during COVID, people started drinking and buying much more whiskey than they probably should have. And
Guilty.
anything that
Yep.
that was age dated was gone.
Mhm.
Um, so one of the things I tell people is think about what you're buying, right? So we are 7 years old as of today, 7 years and change. We don't have anything over 7 years out of the market. You're right. Most of the whiskey that we release is between three and five, with some of the single barrels, 5 years, maybe even six. So rewind back to 2021, and we got our license in 2017. We were the first. We were one of the first to get our license. So rewind back to 2021, 2022 during the heart of COVID. If you saw Japanese whiskey out there 18 years, 25 years, and it wasn't from Suntory or Nika, probably wasn't Japanese whiskey.
Yeah.
it's just some simple math, right? If we're 7 years then, we were 3 years then, so there's no way we were making it. So, and others that got their licenses and weren't were making it. So, anyways, I think it's just about being educated. Back to the point earlier of making sure you know what you're buying, especially if it was 25 years at 779.99. It definitely wasn't Japanese whiskey.
No, absolutely not. But at the same time, on the flip side of that, flip actually, pun not intended, we were seeing the Suntory and Nikas at 18, 21, 25 year, even 30 year, going for just bananas prices. In stores, bananas prices, and then on secondary markets, as we know, both legal and illegal, they were thousands of dollars for some of these bottles. And great as they might be, and I've had some great older Japanese whiskey, they're not worth that amount of money. I don't think I've had a whiskey that's worth that, thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll find one that changes my mind on that, but no, there's a limit to me. And but yeah, so the 48%, I respect that greatly. I think it's also worth noting that Japanese whiskey as a whole, and this is a generalization, but I think it's a stereotype that may hold true for the generalization that I have, is a lot of it for many years was made with the idea of highballs. So, with the exception of those hyper-aged statements. So, the 43% is, I think, what people more associate with Japanese whiskey. It's this lighter profile, if you will, goes easily with some soda or something and a splash of lemon. And it's meant to be almost ephemeral in a way. Whereas this tastes and feels much more like a whiskey that's meant to be enjoyed how you like it, but on its own, and can really stand up on its own without, as you said, that feeling, that wateriness. I found I was writing a note the other day about a whiskey that I really liked the flavor of it, but it felt like on the palate that the water was either added too much or too quickly, and it was like the flavor was there, but it was underwater. And I hate that so much because I'm like, there's flavor there. It's there. They did a good job to create the flavors they wanted, and then just watered it down too much or in the wrong way. And drives you crazy. Like, if there's something bad, then that's just bad. But if it's promising with a fault, that's almost more frustrating.
Putting too much water on espresso to make an Americano, right? It's just not right.
Yeah, this is not right. Yeah. So we have these three core products that are available in the US. Obviously, like I said, they're not in every market, and it's because of that it's somewhat limited, but you can find it. We will help people find that through the show notes and the website as well. I wanted to just dedicate a couple of minutes at the end to talk about something you actually brought it up before I could, which was this revitalization idea of the area, and declining population. So this is a problem that Japan has for sure. We've seen it in multiple areas in Scotland, including recent guests like Isle of Harris and Cabrach, where either through going to war, through clearances, through many different reasons, these areas lose tremendous population. In some cases, like Cabrach, they're under 100 people in the region, as opposed to thousands that used to be there. So you said one of the things that Kamasa-san wants to focus on is revitalizing this region through the work that you do. One of those things being, as you said, purchasing the former elementary school so you could use it. In that Whiskey Magazine interview with Stefan van Eycken, it sounded like, well, Yoshitsugu used the phrase, wanted to become, quote, an indispensable part of the region.
Yep.
So in addition to the buying of the elementary school, it sounds like there's more to that, like job creation and economic
Sure.
drivers that are happening there.
Yeah. I would think about Kyushu as a whole, kind of like, probably like the Finger Lakes region or Napa or Sonoma back in the 70s and 80s, where there was good product being made. There's wine obviously being made, but no one knew about it. There wasn't any tourism around it. Um, and frankly, if you went to Napa in the 80s, you'd knock on a barn door and someone opened the door and you'd like, what do you want? It's like, oh, I want to try some of your wine. What? You want to try what? How do you know I make wine? Sure, come on in. Let me dust off this little workbench and get you a couple paper cups and try, and you can try. And then people would buy, and ultimately became you know 34 years later has become um, probably one of the most popular visited regions. And I think Bardstown and Louisville are going through the same process now, where they're building that into the bourbon culture, bourbon tourism. Um, Obviously, we're much more advanced than those pictures I painted back in the 80s. But I think Kyushu is going through the same thing, where um, there's things happening, but there's also revitalization around. There could be tourism around spirits, and there is. But there's infrastructure that needs to be built in order to make that happen. And that infrastructure comes with jobs and everything else. So Kyushu, I think it was just last year about this time that the New York Times wrote about Kyushu as a tourist destination, right? Just for the ecotourism, the food, everything else. They didn't even contemplate spirits yet. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity where, we and other manufacturers are considering things to make it easier, which again, first of all, starts with infrastructure. And that means, as well as the train system goes in most of Japan, in Kyushu, it's there for kind of larger swaths, but it's kind of like comparing, the trains in New York, the trains here in the Bay Area. You can get to roughly where you need to, but you can't get to exactly where you need to. Like in New York, you can get exactly where you need to get, or comparing New York to Japan, right? It's even hyper exactly where you need to be.
Sure.
So Kyushu's not there yet. So there needs to be transportation infrastructure, there needs to be hotel infrastructure for lodging. There needs to be just more Western restaurants and things, just so that people can feel comfortable coming, because you can go there, but you have to have someone help you navigate. Versus, you can now go to Napa and there's no problem navigating, right? So I think that's happening. I think that'll really help the region, and it will um, revitalize in many ways. It may bring some elements that locals aren't ready for, but I think that's just part of the natural gentrification of any area. And I'm using gentrification in the wrong terms, but you get the concept of this whole community changing. But it'll change, I think, around spirits. Again, over 100 shochu distilleries, over 10 whiskey distilleries now, and growing. Um, there's things for people to see and experience.
I will bet that as we're seeing with the new, really almost any new distillery that's coming out, including Kanosuke, there's the idea of visitors is in mind from the beginning. No more of the stereotypical like gigantic factory distillery in Scotland or America for that matter, in Kentucky, where it's just a giant building or buildings and campus, but no one really goes. Like the new ones are being built with visitor centers in mind and tourism in mind, and the old ones are being retrofitted because they realize it's part of the experience now. It's what people want, and it's not just the super nerds like you and me that want to know the nitty gritty details of everything. It's a more general consumer too that wants the experience and wants to know what's a little bit behind the scenes.
Yeah, I mean, in the art distillery, it was designed by a gentleman named Nakahara-san, and he did a masterful job in making it a modern, timeless piece of art where it's gorgeous. I really encourage you to visit. I'm so lucky that when I'm there, sometimes the offices are so full that I just have to go up to our tasting room, which we call the Mellow Bar, which just happens to overlook that beach and the sea turtles and sunsets. And I check my email from there, and you kind of pinch yourself and say, luckiest guy in the world to be doing this. But I think it's something we need to share with the world. Is Japan ready to embrace this shit? I'm not sure, But we are certainly building plans to have more tourism, not only local but foreign tourism, come into the distillery, into the city, into the pre-prefecture, and kind of stay and enjoy. In fact, it's actually very, very funny. Our second generation founder, the one that invented barrel aged shochu. So we didn't talk on it. We didn't talk about, but I'll touch on it here. He was the one that inspired um, the two brothers, the Kamasa brothers, to continue in spirits, because as they're growing up in the 80s, spirits were not a popular thing, right? But he inspired them so much that they committed that when they both had distillate. So when my boss opened the single malt distillery, his younger brother Norisa took over the family shochu distillery where Hyoki's made, and that's where they kind of got the idea for double distillery, that when we both have liquid of the right age and it makes sense, we want to honor our grandfather by making a double distillery blend to honor him. So internally, we talk about, so this is a passion project for the both of them. So we talk about this as kind of two hearts, one taste, and that liquid is probably the most Scotch of the whiskey that we make, because it is a true blend, and it takes in all the techniques of Scotch blending, takes the techniques of how we distill in Japan, and it creates a product that we use to honor their grandfather. And to kind of take it further, most distillers in Japan follow the Scottish tradition of where they're named after the place where they're at, right? Yamazaki, Hakushu, Miyagi-Kyo. We don't do that. Kanosuke is not a place. Kanosuke is the name of their grandfather. So Kanosuke Kamasa was the second generation founder. So it's a very beautiful family story about what they've done. Every generation has been inspired to innovate, and I'm looking forward to see what they're going to do next. But it could be in spirits, it could be in revising the community. But I feel very bullish on what the Kamasas are going to do, because they've demonstrated for 400 years. So looking forward to sharing that with the world. But the reason I tell a story is that before he passed away, and we actually have it hanging in our office, and I'll send you a picture if you don't have it. Kanosuke Kamasa actually drew a map and a picture by hand of a shochu distillery that had warehouses, that had an amusement park, that had dining, back in like late 70s, early 80s. So his vision was to make a shochu playland, kind of like what people are doing in Kentucky and Napa now, and what you're doing in Scotland now with shochu. So he didn't ever get to accomplish it with shochu, but his grandsons are going to do it with whiskey in the same
Beautiful.
location where he drew that picture.
That's beautiful. I think that sentiment, that place is the perfect place to end it. So, Roland, thank you so much for coming on and talking about Kanosuke, the brand, the family, the Kamasa family, the history, the whiskey, everything that goes into the sense of place that I just absolutely loved when I first tried it, loved when I first heard about it, and I'm glad to be talking to you about it tonight. Hang on with me for just a second after we finish recording.
Sure.
All right. Once again, this has been Whiskey Ring Podcast. Thank you, everyone, for listening. There will be show notes, reviews, more information that we didn't get to on air about these releases, and as I said, places where you can find them, or hopefully have a friend who can find them and get them to you. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Like, rate, subscribe wherever you listen, and I will see you all next week.